90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is attorney Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today, my guest is Lisa Skinner. She's a behavior specialist, and she's going to discuss lawyers and dementia. This is a very important topic about lawyers or their clients who may suffer from the early signs of Alzheimer's or dementia. What some of the signs are that their colleagues and families should be aware of, ways to delay the disease, and steps that should be taken at the earliest possible time so that the lawyer can continue to function or the client's needs will be met after the possible diagnosis of an illness. Lisa, welcome to Law You Should Know.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for having me.
It's a very difficult topic, but lawyers want to make sure that their colleagues are fully functioning so they can give appropriate advice and legal services to their clients. And people in all walks of life may have issues concerning dementia or Alzheimer's, and lawyers need to recognize these symptoms as well so that they can put their affairs in order, their business affairs, their legal affairs, their estates, while they are still competent to do so. And I'm sure you'll have many good suggestions for lawyers and their clients. Perhaps you can start off by just telling us what the difference is and just describing Alzheimer's and dementia and what some of the early warning signs are.
Okay, so the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia is actually not a disease. Alzheimer's is an actual disease. It's one of over 70 brain diseases that cause dementia. Dementia is really an umbrella term that's used to describe the symptoms that are associated with a brain disease like Alzheimer's that it causes. And they vary from person to person. I usually relate it to getting the flu because most of us at one point or another in our lives have had the flu. But we all experience different symptomology when we have the flu. Some of us get fever, some of us get body aches, some of us have tummy troubles, but not everybody displays the same symptoms, even though they all have the same flu.
So what are some of the symptoms that someone in the early stages of dementia might have?
Well, this is where this disease gets kind of tricky and kind of complicated, because in the very early stages of the disease, the symptoms are subtle. They're very subtle. And a lot of times they can be just signs of normal aging forgetfulness. Most people, believe it or not, are not diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or one of the other brain diseases till they're already in their mid stages. They can live with the early signs and symptoms for years. But there are definitely some significant signs that you'd want to watch for that really differentiate the two. So let me give you a couple examples. One of the very common signs or behaviors that we see with people with actual brain disease is they have a hard time finding the right words. Sometimes they replace the word with a made up scenario. That's called confabulation. When they're telling you something, they all of a sudden their brain can't think of the appropriate word, so they fill it in with a made-up scenario.
Okay. So if they realize they can't come up with the right word at that moment, that's a good thing. If they substitute some kind of made-up word, that's a bad thing. That's a question for you.
I think it's kind of an instinctive way to protect yourself and protect yourself from being embarrassed, protect yourself from being obvious that you're having a problem thinking of the right word.
Is some kind of memory fog normal at a certain point? In fact, not just in aging, but let's say emerging from COVID or some other illnesses?
Memory fog actually is caused by a lot of different things. You see it with women who are experiencing urinary tract infections, depression, dementia, COVID, I understand. There's and
maybe even medication can
absolutely, yes. Medication.
Or just even a feeling of depression, just someone's having a blue day. All these things may cause the brain fog. So how can you distinguish whether it's dementia or not, or Alzheimer's?
When you're really starting to see consistent patterns of things like repetitive behavior. This is very common in people who are actually have a brain disease that's causing dementia. They, in the same conversation, they may repeat a question over and over again. And the reason why is they don't remember that they just asked it.
So if someone repeats something once, a question or an answer, would that be a sign of it? Because maybe they really don't remember, after during a long conversation, if they said something or heard something, it would be when they mentioned it a number of times?
It's pretty blatantly obvious when somebody actually has dementia and they start asking the same question over and over and over again. If you're in a conversation with somebody and they ask a question and then they ask it a few minutes later, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could, but it doesn't necessarily.
And what if they make the same statement, like they just repeat something every few minutes?
Yes, or maybe tell you the same story over and over again. I've seen people do that multiple times where they just keep repeating an experience they had.
And is that part of Alzheimer's, or is that some other brain issue?
That is actually one of the signs of Alzheimer's disease, but it's also a common behavior of people that have dementia caused by other brain diseases.
So if this happens on more than one occasion, if it happens on a regular basis, that's a warning sign let's say in a family or friend or a legal colleague.
Well, this is what I've seen. When the behaviors and or symptoms really become blatantly obvious, and by then they're usually in their mid-stage, and that's usually when a doctor would make a diagnosis, almost inevitably the family members would tell me, well, now that we think back about it, there were signs, but we just didn't think that much of it because they were so subtle. So that's what makes this disease difficult, because they can be developing dementia for years, but the signs and symptomologies are so subtle that it really doesn't grab your attention until it gets to the point where it is just so blatantly obvious.
And that's why I'm glad to have you on the show, because hopefully with the knowledge you're conveying, that people can pick up on it earlier for themselves or for others. And then the next question would be, is there something to slow the progress of this disease?
Well, once you've been diagnosed with it, there are several medications that doctors prescribe. One's called Aricept and one's called Namenda. There's a patch too. And that actually slows down the progression of the disease. But there's no cure, and it's not reversible. It'll just slow down the progression. But once it hits its wall, and then typically you see a major decline in that person.
And when you say wall, what do you mean by that?
It just at some point stops working.
And that's their mind and their body.
And then you usually, you'll see kind of they they just decline very significantly. So,
but it may be years till they hit that wall.
Yeah, it could be years, it could be months. I've seen both. I've seen it both ways, where the Aricept or the Namenda seem to hit a plateau for a period of time, and then it just stops working.
But a plateau could be a good thing. If they can reach a plateau and people recognize that they are still physically and mentally capable of different things, it's a good thing, especially considering the alternative.
Well, they'll need less care.
Are there any other things that can slow down the progression?
Yeah,
physical exercise, mental exercise, music, conversation?
All of the above.
Okay.
What we have learned is there are many risk factors that are involved in increasing a person's chances of developing Alzheimer's disease. And the number one risk factor is age. And we can't do anything about that. It's a non-modifiable risk. But there are many other health risks that can be controlled, managed, or modified that will then lower somebody's risk. So the more of these risk factors that you have going against you, the higher risk you are at developing dementia.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The second highest risk for developing dementia, believe it or not, is cardiovascular disease. And if it's managed and treated with medication, then that will lower that risk back down. So you have to take into consideration what's modifiable and what's not modifiable. The age thing you cannot do anything about. Race plays a part in being a high risk factor. Some races are more vulnerable to developing Alzheimer's disease than other races. So that's something that's non-modifiable because you can't change your race.
Right. And what about genes?
Well, genes, yes. So to give you an example, I personally have 8 family members that have been afflicted with some brain disease that causes dementia. 5 of them are blood relatives and 3 of them were through marriage. That's a high risk factor for me because it obviously runs in my family, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I will develop it. But there are things that I can do to lower my risk by a proper diet, exercising, doing things to exercise and stimulate your brain. One of the best things people can do is learn a foreign language because the parts of the brain that you use to learn that foreign language really stimulate your brain. Doing puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, crossword puzzles. These are all things that you can control at any age that will eventually, that will lower your risk of developing dementia.
And what about other cultural experiences, art, music, news? Do those help at all?
Music actually triggers memory, so it does trigger brain stimulation.
Okay.
But, for example, just sitting watching a television program, most people kind of veg out, and that's it's not doing a whole lot of stimulation to your brain.
But if you're taking courses, even if it's not a foreign language, if you're learning about something, if you're going to a lecture.
Taking courses is an excellent thing to.
Even if it's not about a foreign language or a crossword puzzle, just taking courses, learning, you're using your brain.
Yes.
And what type of physical exercise works best?
This is something that people can start at any age to lower their risk of developing dementia. So any type of exercise is healthy. If you're in your 60s or 70s, a lot of people now are walking or swimming or playing tennis. And if you're younger and you're in your 30s and you realize that you can actually do things now at this point in your life to lower your risk of developing dementia, whatever your form of exercise is, just keep doing it because it'll ultimately keep you healthy. Diet is very important too. They recommend a kind of a Mediterranean type of diet, whole grains and fruits, and not a lot of red meat, not a lot of artificial things.
And just in terms of a social network, being engaged with people, being engaged with family, physically and mentally and socially, is that important also?
It's actually very important. Yes. And that's one of the things that family members or attorneys or business owners might actually notice a change in the person that might be showing signs. Is because in the early stages, they typically start withdrawing from social situations. But it's very important for them to maintain social situations because isolation can exacerbate.
So their colleagues, their friends and colleagues should help to keep them in the loop, intellectually, socially, through bargs, what's happening in the firm, what's happening in bar associations. That's important to keep them going mentally and physically. Yes.
Another sign to look for is when it's actually you have a brain disease that's causing your dementia. You can't retain new information. So if you're taking a course and you can't remember anything that you just learned, then that's a sign. We all lose something. We lose our keys, we lose our glasses. It's one thing to lose something and then you find it. It's another thing to pick up a set of keys and not understand the function of those keys. If you don't know what you're supposed to do with the keys, that's a problem. That's a red flag that you have something much more serious going on than normal aging forgetfulness.
And what can other colleagues or family members do to deal with these symptoms?
If somebody is noticing the things I just described, the repetitive questioning, the not understanding what the function of your keys are or your coffee maker, you just can't figure out how to work it even though you've been using it for years and years and years. If these things are really starting to become obvious and all lining up, then my recommendation would go to your doctor and get an evaluation.
So if you've been misplacing your keys for years, so it's nothing new, then you probably don't have to worry. If you started misplacing your keys and it's a new challenge you have, then maybe there's more cause for concern.
I would say if you notice that the person picks up their keys and then they have absolutely no idea what it's for. It's like let's say you're there with your mom and your mom picks up the keys and say, "Oh, Mom, are you going somewhere? You just picked up your keys." And then she has absolutely no clue why she picked up those keys or that they go to the car and that means she's going to go somewhere. That is a red flag.
I'd like to remind our listeners that you are listening to Law You Should Know. We're talking with Lisa Skinner. She's a behavior specialist, and she's also the author of Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost. And she's talking to us about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, how colleagues can recognize the early warning signs of those illnesses in lawyers or in their clients. And we're going to talk about some of the legal issues that should be addressed when a person may be in their early stages of those diseases. I think you may have touched on it before, Lisa, but what are some of the differences between Alzheimer's disease and dementia?
Dementia really is an umbrella term that's used to describe the symptoms that are caused by Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or Lewy body disease or frontotemporal lobe disease. Those are all brain diseases. Dementia is not an actual disease. It's really the symptoms of the disease.
And some other brain diseases are more about physical consequences rather than intellectual or mental or emotional ones?
They all cause damage to the brain and the brain cells. but they attack different parts of the brain depending on what type of brain disease it is. Alzheimer's is the most common. It's the one that we are all most familiar with. And most of us associate Alzheimer's disease with memory loss and confusion. Those are the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, because the first place that Alzheimer's disease attacks is the short-term memory.
So that's why a person might remember things from long ago, but not remember what they had for lunch that day.
That's correct, because our long-term memory stays intact for the duration of the disease. So once our short-term memory reaches a certain point of no return and it's so damaged and stops functioning, it's like short-circuiting, then that person pulls from their long-term memory. So what you just described is very common. They can remember a recipe that their mother gave them without having it in front of them. They know exactly what ingredients go into it because it's something that they learned when they were much, much younger, but they can't remember what they had for breakfast.
And that's another warning sign to families or people in law firms out there in terms of their colleagues or their clients is about the short-term memory. If they take notes or keep a diary or calendar or listing of their activities, does that help with the short-term memory at all or not really?
Yeah, we do. We recommend what we call prompting or cueing, which actually does help. So when you're probably in the mid stage of the disease, and maybe your mother likes to empty the dishwasher, you might put little Post-it notes on where the knives go or where the plates go, and that will prompt her memory of where the different items go, because that's something that she probably will no longer remember on her own.
Is it important for someone to be proactive versus reactive if they get that diagnosis?
Well, there are a lot of reasons to be proactive, but some of the reasons are just to protect their assets and their property, because while they still have a presence of mind and can make their own decisions, because eventually they won't be able to, they'll have to have somebody make medical decisions for them and legal decisions. So it's best to be proactive when you start seeing these signs, and then you go to the doctor, and maybe the doctor says, okay, well, it's not quite Alzheimer's disease yet. I'm going to call this mild cognitive impairment, which is usually the beginning stage of it. That might be the best time to consult an attorney, get a trust set up, because at some point they'll have diminished capacity.
And I also want to mention, healthcare proxy and wills, all these things that a person needs to do while they're competent and able to do so, because after they've traveled too far down the road, they may not be able to.
Well, then the family is left to make decisions, and family members, from what I've seen, always want to try to do what they think the parent would have wanted. So if you get that all out of the way, questions like, do you want to be cremated or do you want to be buried? Who do you want your things to go to? And get all of this stuff sorted out.
I agree. In terms of care, can a person remain at home with some help, or for more advanced stages, are there treatment programs that specialize in that kind of thing? Residential, hospitals or homes?
For institutional type settings, there's assisted living and there's memory care. Memory care is for people who have more advanced cognitive decline and they really need help with all of activities of daily living. Staying at home is a tough question. People ask me this all the time. When would I know when it's no longer safe for my mom to live alone? And there are a lot of reasons for somebody with Alzheimer's disease or dementia to not live alone. It can be a very unsafe environment.
Right.
And one of the things that can happen very easily, but they can hire help in. It's very expensive, but you could hire like a home health service to come in and help with the activities of daily living. But
Go ahead.
one of the things that I have seen more often than I care to is a person seems to be doing fine living on their own with, beginning to mid-stage dementia, and they walk out of their house one day, and then all of a sudden the short-term memory switch just gets flipped off. They don't know who they are, where they are. They wander around, they get lost. And that's a very, very dangerous situation. And it can happen on the turn of a dime without any warning at all.
And Lisa, what advice do you have for the family members who are saddened by the change in their relationship with their loved one?
My advice is to learn as much as you can about what's happening to the brain of the person that has the disease and the behaviors that surface as a result of the disease. Learn to recognize those behaviors and then also learn how to effectively respond to those behaviors. Because I can tell you this, your response, the correct responses are counterintuitive to what our instinctive responses are.
Can you give an example of that?
Yes. One of the very common things that we see with people with dementia is what we call false beliefs. Very commonly, a woman will start talking about her husband like he's sitting in the chair next to her, but he's been deceased for years.
And so what's the best response to that?
Join their reality.
Keep it real for them. That helps them. It's a real memory, just a little bit off in time and space.
Because a lot of times these short-term memory burps, I guess you could call them, don't last for very long. They can
relish the moment. And Lisa, what's your blog site?
It's on Facebook, and it's called Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost. And I post a lot of tools and tips and information to help people who are going through this dilemma with a loved one to make.
Okay, and that's also the name of your book. I'd like to thank Lisa Skinner for talking to us about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, how they can be recognized in lawyers and others, and what to do with them, how to best cope with them. You've been listening to Law You Should Know on 90.3 WHPC. If you missed any portion of the program or you want to tell someone else about it, the podcast is at nccradio.org. Please join us next week at the same time for another program on Law You Should Know.